So good afternoon, welcome again to another AppDev technical talk for our professional services community. If you're new to these sessions, we've got the previous recordings to play at that link there. Previously, I kind of called them lunch and learns, but I felt technical talk was a slightly better name to go forward with. And my purpose of these sessions is to focus on topics that are new, not well known, and trying to generate content that's slightly different to what else that already exists. The target audience is developers, software engineers, and the content is mainly to be of a technical nature. The microphones are currently disabled, but we'll enable them at the end for any questions, but along the way, kind of use chat. And then with the two of us kind of presenting, we may struggle to keep up with the chat. So if anyone can help contribute to the answers, please feel free and add any responses. If any questions are not fully answered or we miss, please repeat at the end when we open up the mics or send them in to me afterwards. And as usual, the recording will be made available at the same link as today's invite. And today's agenda is external identity for developers. I kind of suggested that on the last call as a potential subject, and I got considerable positive response. So that's what we're going with. So my name is Mark Harrison. I'm an Azure AppDev specialist. I'm part of the various account teams that are aligned to customers in our professional services sector. So the invites went out to organizations that I'm associated with, and there's my contact details. And then as part of my role, I've got access to a team of knowledgeable, experienced cloud solution architects who I can call on to help when the ask is of an in-depth or complex nature. And for today's session, I'm delighted to be joined by Baljinder Singh, one of our security-focused cloud solution architects. So let's start with a high-level overview of identity and the Microsoft Identity Platform, and then I'm going to pass on to Bal to go a little bit deeper into the technology around modern authentication. In today's connected world, people accessing your systems could be anyone and located anywhere. For example, you might have trusted people now working from anywhere, often on trusted networks, and there is a high risk of untrusted people present on your trusted networks. So many security experts will claim that identity has become the most important protection mechanism in information security. Now, identity will combine with access controls to impose rules on who can access what and what level of access they have. So, for example, a user may have access to a data store, but be limited to read-only access. Access controls can also generate audit trails, audit logs of who did what for later analysis. Identity access solutions require both authentication and authorization. It's important to recognize the difference. So, authentication is the process of identifying a user and being confident they are really who they say they claim to be. And this could involve multiple checks. So it might be the user has to provide some piece of knowledge, such as a password, or they may have to own something like a specific token with an authentication app. Or perhaps there's biometric checks, which may be fingerprint and face recognition. And it could also involve conditional access. So, for example, different rules are applied depending on the networks or geography that you're accessing from. And then authorization is that process of determining if an authenticated user is granted the rights to perform the action they want to take. So, depending on the scope of the application, this could be restricted to an internal audience, or it might also need to extend out to external partners, such as suppliers, business partners, and customers. And for some scenarios, it might not be just about people. Identities can also be assigned to trusted devices and services. Now, authentication will be the linchpin of the security of your application. But it's a hard. When you start to read the technical documentation about identity, you very quickly realize this is a complex topic, and to implement your own robust, feature-rich solution is not a trivial exercise. Authentication systems are a common attack for bad actors, so you can't risk of any vulnerabilities or weaknesses that could be exploited. And the only way to really test your system is secure is to have lots of clever people trying to break it over a long period of time. You won't have that with any system that you roll out yourself. Always use something that is provided by a company that you trust and one that has many skilled experts working in the security space. And then that time that's freed up, you can then, then spend that time refocusing on parts of your app that add value. So what developers want is an authentication solution with advanced security features like multi-factor auth and conditional access out of the box. So they don't have to build it and they don't have to maintain it. It needs to work with platforms, languages, and tools they choose. Developers don't want to change the fundamentals of how they work. And it needs to conform to industry standards, have published interfaces to interoperate with any existing identity and access management solution. And of course, it needs to be easy to get started. So let's drill down a little bit more. In the graphic, we've got an application and back-end APIs. The authentication logic has been pulled out of the application and given over to a separate service that we call the identity provider. Now, when an unknown user accesses the application, there is a redirection to the identity provider to which the user must prove they are who they claim to be. Now, this could be passwords, or as we've discussed, it could be some more advanced mechanisms such as maybe biometrics or maybe a combination of the two. Once the identity provider is confident the user is who they claim to be, it will create a kind of security token that will contain the information about the user, such as their name, maybe their email address or their organization. And for modern authentication, the format of that security token is called a JSON web token or a JOT token. And sometimes there's multiple tokens created with slightly different purposes, such as there could be ID tokens, there could be access tokens, and there could be refresh tokens. So once that token has been created, it can then be presented to the application, much like the ticket inspector here, who will do the authorization and check the information in the token. And then it can make business logic decisions based on who the user is and what they're allowed to do. So for example, it might just allow or deny access, or perhaps it will give a subset of functionality. Now note the trust line between the application and the identity provider. We will see that where that's configured in the next slide, and it's going to be something that Bao will be drilling into when he talks about app registrations. So this graphic here shows the key components of the Microsoft Identity Platform. First, it's underpinned by open industry standards, and Microsoft are key members and contributors to the relevant working groups. And then by supporting such standards, it enables the identity platform to interoperate with other solutions in this space. We've got a number of identity providers with standard compliant endpoints such as Azure AD, Azure AD B2C, and then the Microsoft Accounts identity provider. Then there are libraries called the Microsoft Authentication Libraries, or MSAL, for building web, mobile, desktop apps with there's support for many languages. This reduces the amount of code that you need to write in your apps when working with the identity platform. And then it is the app registration that is the administration function for defining those policies and creating those trust relationships between the applications and the identity providers. So Azure AD identity provider is the world's largest identity service. And there's the metrics there, showing many thousands of organizations, millions of active users, and billions of daily requests that Azure AD is currently under processing. And then this slide is kind of always out of date because these numbers are kind of rising fast. And then we've got Azure AD B2C. This is a superset of Azure AD functionality. So it inherits all the foundations of Azure AD, but it's kind of targeting functionality that's about engaging with external identities. So it can federate to a number of other social identity providers, but then it can also federate to corporate identity providers by using OpenID Connect. And then there's a kind of graphic in the middle that shows that you can kind of brand that logon experience to take on your corporate branding. If you're looking at documentation, much of it is referring to Azure AD external identities. Now, this is a kind of vision and direction that was announced last year, and it's going to drive the future of Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. There's a link there that will explain when you should use one or the other. But the big difference is with Azure AD, you're adding users as guests and they're being present in your corporate directory. So that kind of works well with kind of collaboration apps like Microsoft Teams. When you go Azure AD B2C, this is in a completely separate directory to your corporate directory. And so this is ideal for custom developed applications. Now, Azure AD used to have the idea of needing one P1 or P2 license for every 5 external users. We've now kind of simplified things. We've now got this common licensing for external users across both Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. And it is free for the first 50,000 monthly active users. So if a user logs in once, it doesn't matter how many times they authenticate in that calendar month, it counts as one MAU. Okay, we're going to drill down a little bit deeper now and see how this all hangs together. So this diagram is showing an app. It's got powered by backend APIs. It's got B2C on that diagram. So showing B2C is a superset of Azure AD. And when the user accesses the app, hits the sign in button, it'll get redirected to the identity provider where they have to prove who they are. That will then create a JOT token that is then passed to the app, and the app can make a decision whether it's going to allow that user to either access it or not, or maybe give a subset of functionality. And then that JOT token can also be passed to backend APIs for further authorization. So that JOT token, there's a kind of what a JOT token looks like. So on the left-hand side, it's encoded. That's how it kind of travels over the wire. But on the right-hand side, so it's base 64 encoded. When you decode it, that's what it kind of looks like. So it's a series of kind of name value pairs. And if you look in there, you can start to see you've got the name of somebody, you've got their email, you've got the issue that kind of generated that token. And as I said, that JOT token is then passed through to those apps for inspection and authorization. Now, just expanding the diagram a bit, B2C can federate with other identity providers that support modern web authentication protocols. So the diagram in the kind of right-hand corner is showing this is where it's kind of interconnecting to your corporate Azure AD. So this might be really good if you've got internal people want to access your application. They can just hit a button and say, I'm an internal person, and it will go and authenticate against Azure AD, come back with the appropriate JOT token. And then on the left-hand side, bottom, it's kind of showing that you could be kind of federating with other clients that are using Azure AD, but it could be other identity providers. It doesn't have to be Azure AD, thanks to these kind of standards in the modern web authentication protocols and standards. And then it could also optionally be maybe social identity providers, so things like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and etc. The last thing to kind of call out on this diagram, top right-hand corner, is what we can actually do is extend that authentication. So as people are signing in, we can call functions or business logic to apply extra processing. So an example scenario is maybe you've got a customer loyalty type application. What we can actually do is call a backend function as people are signing in, and then augment that JOT token with additional information. So if it's a customer loyalty app, maybe you want to put the customer loyalty application number into the so I've just had a message, people aren't seeing the slides. Can people see the one with extensibility on? Yeah, so I think whoever said that they're not seeing the slides, perhaps jump in and out again. Yeah, so I'm just talking about extensibility. Okay, so the slide you should be seeing, it says demo, and I'm going to demo some of this. So what I'm going to do is just create let me reorganize things a bit. So I'm going to create an app, and what I'm going to do is connect it to the Azure AD B2C. Let's go here. Let's make a folder. Let's call it Mark July 12th. Actually, before I do that, let's actually show you B2C, my B2C instance. Let's log in. Okay, so those that are familiar with Azure AD and directories, what we've got here is a separate directory to the corporate directory. So it's Azure AD B2C. So I've created that, like everything in Azure with the plus sign. You go and say, I want a B2C instance. Also, just to kind of flag, there's a Azure AD instance underpinning this. So B2C is a superset of AAD functionality. So if I go in here, what we can see is a number of configuration items. So we've got the app registrations. This is where we connect and define that trust relationship between your application and the directory. What we'll see is when I create an app shortly, we'll see something appear in here. This is where we've got our identity providers. So you can see, in here is kind of Apple, Facebook, etc. What I've got is I've wired up my instance to Facebook, and I've also wired it up to a separate Azure AD instance. And we can also have local accounts. So we have users in this directory. What we have is the concept of user flows that defines the policies, and I've got one here for sign in, sign up. So this is where we can define things like what are the claims we expect. We can define the layouts that you might want to customize, and we can actually run and test it here. So in here, this is the application. That's the reply. So when you get authenticated, where you want to redirect to, this is the endpoint. This is where your log on button would take you to. So if I actually run and test it here, this is the logon experience. So you can see I've got I can redirect to Azure AD. I can log on to Facebook. So if I click the Facebook button, so there's a kind of dance going on behind the scenes. I've already logged on to Facebook, so you don't actually get an experience. And you can actually see the claims. So you can see what my IDP is. You can see my name in Facebook, and I can see my email from Facebook. So let's create a web app and connect it to Azure B2C. I'm going to use the standard .NET tooling and pass B2C as the authentication provider. To create the source code for the app. And then I'm going to use the .NET tool to add the app registration to both the B2C provider and then to inject the relevant information into our source code. So we can see it's creating the app and it's injecting those values into the source code. So if I now switch to app registrations, just do a refresh on that, we can see here it's added that app registration. So it's created that trust between my code and Azure AD B2C. So let's open up our source code in Visual Studio. Let's find the project. Okay, here's our project that we created. So if you open up the app settings file, we can see the B2C information that was inserted by that .NET tool into the settings file. So we can see the B2C instance, we can see the client ID of the app registration, we can see the sign up, sign in policy ID. I'm going to open up the home page. This file here. And I'm going to just put a little bit of code in here that's going to basically open the jot token and display the contents of it. So it's just going to enumerate through the claims, identity information, print out the name, value pairs, and then just display it. So let's run our application. Okay, mark July 12th. Let's sign in. We get that same logon screen that we looked at before, but this time what I'll do is I'll log in with an Azure AD account. So it's going to go to this AD, AppDev Challenge on Microsoft.com. The password. Then it's going to redirect back and display those claims. So we can see it's user 25. That's the email. We can see the identity provider. Let's pass on to Bal, who's going to kind of look and go a little bit deeper under the covers. So, Bal, can you take over, take control?
As Mark mentioned, my name is Baljinder Singh. I'm a cloud solution architect. We focus on security within, Microsoft Cloud Solutions, really. So what we're talking about here is Mark's quite nicely set up the platform for us to go a bit deeper into it. So all we're going to do is literally kind of explore the terms that Mark's used in his presentation. So when we talk about, he started with authorization and authentication. So that's what we're gonna start with. So I'm not gonna spend all time here and talk about saying what authorization and authentication is. Mark's kind of touched on it. So it's literally whether a user or an application trying to access a protected resource has the right amount of privilege to access that protected resource or not. That's authorization. And your authentication is the process of establishing and communicating that the person operating the app or browser or whatever is who they claim to be. So what we're going to look at here is what we actually use within Azure AD, what protocols we use to establish authorization and authentication. So first thing first is we use OAuth 2. So that's a protocol that we use for authorization to start with. But the problem with OAuth 2 is it's not meant to deliver the authentication. And it is assumed that the person granting access might not be a user. And so because there's no identity data, so it's mentioned, but there's no confirmation. So to get over that hurdle, we use a protocol called OpenID Connect, which is built on top of OAuth flows. And all it adds to that is identity info. So your authentication on top of authorization that equals OpenID Connect. So those are two flows that we use within Azure AD to achieve our authorization authentication. Going forward, the key components for the OAuth 2 operation are well, four really. It boils down to four components. So you've got a user over here. I'm not sure if you can see my there. So you've got a user over here. All it tries to do is tries to access an app. He wants to access some sort of resource. He's got an app to get to that resource. He tries to access the app. App goes to a server saying, get me a token. And user gets redirected to that server to authenticate and consent. And that server sends a token back to the app. So what we got around by doing that is that app that user is trying to use doesn't need to know about user's credentials anymore. It just deals with a token. User authenticates elsewhere. So we don't need to store any credentials over there, or it doesn't even need to know about it. And what happens is when it gets the token back, it calls a resource to get the data. So now the four components we're talking about, we've got a client, we've got a resource server where everything is sitting. We've got an authorization server that is authenticating and authorizing. And then we've got a resource owner. So when we talk about OAuth 2, we're talking about essentially these four components. So that's very basic flow. I think that's what it comes down to. But to get these tokens, or to request these tokens and to get these tokens back, to issue these tokens, they're very specific flows that are defined within OAuth 2 based on different scenarios. So that's what we're going to try and have a look at in going forward in the following slides. So we've spoken about four categories there, so they're all here. So the protocol flow, how it happens. So client, so resource owner, remember a user, goes to a client, and client sends an authorization request back to the resource owner. Resource owner then sends something called authorization grant. And now that is something that we'll get to in the following slides. So authorization grant goes back to client, and client uses that authorization grant to go to the authorization server to get something called access token. Now client has ended up with an access token and still doesn't know anything about the user's credentials at all. So it uses that access token and it goes to a resource server. It says, this is my access token, give me access. So based on the access token, resource provides the protected resource back to the client. So that's the basic flow in OAuth 2, the way it happens. Now, this is a very quick slide. It just says what are the goals for OAuth 2 and OIDC, which is OpenID Connect. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is the process. So the process for OAuth 2, it uses one of the OAuth 2 defined flow types, which has very specific grants or types of flows that we'll talk about. And for OIDC, it uses, only thing it adds to that is an ID token on top of access token. So yeah, that's another point actually to keep in mind, the different types of clients that we look at. So we've got confidential clients. When we talk about clients, so there can be confidential clients or there can be public clients, and the OAuth authorization grants or flows are specifically based on what type of clients that you use, as well as what type of application that you use. So obviously the basic is it securely stores the client password in it. But public clients, they cannot store the password securely. So there are two types: confidential clients, public clients. So now we've spoken about tokens, we've spoken about grants in those OAuth flows. So we're talking about tokens. Tokens is something, as I mentioned earlier, that a client and a resource server or authorization server can exchange between each other instead of using the user credentials. So we have essentially three types of tokens. So we're talking about an access token. Now, Mark mentioned JOT, so there can be an access type of JOT token. So access token is something that it contains information about the user and the resource for which the token is intended. Right, so the other token is ID token that we touched upon as well. So the identity token or ID token it contains the user info. So ID tokens are used, they're used by the client to authenticate the user. So the access token is given to give the access, as the name suggests, and ID token is to authenticate the user by the clients. And the access token are used by the resource server. So that's a little difference between them as well. The third token that Mark mentioned as well was a refresh token. Now those access token or ID tokens, they have really limited time, lifetime, if you like. So I think it's typically about 1 hour for each. So what happens after 1 hour? Authorization server can provide a refresh token when it gives the access token to a client. So, and the client, when this access token expires, client can use a refresh token to get a new set of access and refresh tokens needed. So that depends on application config, obviously, how it goes. But these are 3 types of tokens. And then we're talking about flows and grants. So it's literally, it's the way these tokens are exchanged. So those are defined in certain flows. What is the defined flow? So they're named flows for it. So that's what we'll look at. So that's it quickly. I think Mark mentioned, he explained it quite well, to be fair, he showed it. So a JOT token, it's a base 64 encrypted token, which looks like something like this. Obviously it's not the right one, but yeah, it has a header part that has a type, which is JOT. It has algorithm. It's got a claim part. It's got issuer audience. It's got expiry time. It's got name or scope or permissions that user has. Those claims in there, and it has an optional signature as well, so you can have it secured. So that's a basic JOT token. Now the grants is the important bit. So we're talking about exchanging the tokens. So these are the flows or the grants that are defined within OAuth to exchange those tokens. So the first type is the authorization code. So what we'll do, I think I've got so the way authorization code works is obviously, so the resource owner goes to the client to get a resource or whatever, want to access something. Client redirects the resource owner to the authorization server. Then the resource owner authenticates there and grants the consent. And then that authorization server sends the authorization code back to the client. So it's gone there, it's authenticated, and it receives back an authorization code, which doesn't mean anything to anyone but the client, really. So client gets that. It doesn't even actually mean anything to the client. Client sends that authorization code to authorization server. Now it knows where it's come from, who it's come from, who it's come for. That's when the authorization server provides the access token back to the client, and then client can use that access token to get to the resource, wherever it is. So that's the authorization code flow. That's one type. The next part is just an extension of authorization code, which is proof key of code exchange. Well, it's called PXE, so authorization code with PXE. So I think that it was originally designed to protect mobile apps, but its ability to prevent authorization code injection makes it useful for every OAuth client. So it's kind of securing the authorization code even more on top of it to use it. So the next type of flow is implicit. So implicit is obviously you've got a JavaScript app, same flow, so client redirects the resource owner. That one thing that lacks in implicit flow is the authorization code flow. So when user requests access, the client obviously redirects to authorization server, then resource owner authenticates there, same step, but that's where it changes. So after the authentication, instead of receiving the authorization code that client can send to authorization server, it just sends the access token back to the server component. And obviously it does what it needs to do with it and sends it back to the client. So it misses the very important bit of authorization code. Now, the other type is resource owner password credential, which is very simple. So it actually presents the password. So resource owner gives credentials to the client, and then client presents those credentials to the authorization server, and the authorization server provides the access token back. So now, obviously, with this, client has access to users' credentials. So that's major difference. So that's one other type of flow. Now we got to the client credentials. Now this is very handy. This is when there is no user context. You have a daemons or any application trying to access a protected resource. So it will just client authenticates with its own secrets and it gets the access token back. So that's client credentials, and this is quite handy when it comes down to where an API is authenticating to get access to another API. So one more type of flow, which is quite important, is the device code. So device code flow is quite handy when it comes down to the apps that run on a browserless client. So you've got a client that can't log users in. So in that case, what happens is a client requests a token from the authorization server, and it just sends a short code back. And a user can use that code to authenticate on a different device, not on the device where it needs to get access to the resource. So it uses that short code that is provided back to authenticate and present that code to authorization server on a different device. And then the access token in the backend is sent back to the client. So that's another type of flow. Now, one thing that's important that I want to talk about here is these two, implicit and resource owner password credentials. We've seen they have a bit of a kind of a security hole in them. This one completely skips the authorization codes part, and this one completely provides the user credentials to the, well, it has access to the user credentials. So they are actually looked at as deprecated flows. So we are really encouraged not to use any of these two flows and depend on authorization code and the other codes depending on your situation you are in. So now the application object, that's where things get interesting in AAD. So that's when Mark mentioned the trust between the application and the identity provider. So the first thing that you need to do is you create an application registration, which is also called an application object. Now that's literally simply telling the identity platform that this is the name of my app, or this is an authentication process, or the protocols that I'm going to use, or some sort of branding, etc. for your app. Really, you can define your application secrets that you can use using the client credentials flow that we mentioned in the previous part. Now there's few points to notice about these. So you see them in an application registrations blade within Azure portal. So when Mark obviously registered an application using I'm not sure which interface he used, but it came up in application registration. You can use application registration UI to register the apps as well. But the key point is it is literally just a presentation. Identity platform wouldn't know anything about your application if you haven't registered it. it's got to know about it, and the only way it's going to know about it is for identity platform, that is your application. You've got more stuff happening in the background, you've got your code and everything, but as far as I'm concerned, from identity perspective, that's your application that you registered. So one thing, issue with after registering the app, you still have to provide some sort of access to the users within that directory, or some sort of assignments, some sort of permissions. You've got to provide some sort of policy access to that application. You know, you've got to provide some local settings for an app. And that applies to a multi-tenant. So one thing I forgot to mention was application object or application registration. It can be of two types. It can be a single tenant or a multi-tenant. So you have to define it when you register an app, if it's a multi-tenant or single tenant app. So that's when this thing comes in handy. So because you have to do all this stuff to the application within directory, you have to use something called service principal, and that comes under the enterprise app blade within Azure AD. So you see application registrations, and then you see enterprise apps. So that's how they're related. So you need a service principal to provide all those things that were mentioned above. So within a tenant, you've got an application registration, plus you have a service principal. Now, service principal gets created. If you create an application in UI, it gets created automatically. So you will end up with exactly the same name, service principal, within enterprise apps when you register an application in a tenant. Now, how do they come in handy? So you have application registration in one tenant. If your application was a multi-tenant application and users in this tenant wanted to access this application, this app registration doesn't get created in that tenant, but it's that service principal. It gets another service principal created in that tenant for that app. So in essence, it's literally, it enables sign in, and it's a local representation of a global application object in a single tenant. So that application is a multi-tenant application, and it represents that application in there. So one key thing to remember in that as well is all it uses, because it's derived from that, is used, application registration is used as a blueprint for creation of this service principal. Now, this is a quick process how it gets created. So you've got an application in tenant A, for example, and you have a user in tenant B that wants to create access that application. So all it does is it attempts to sign into that application. It goes to obviously it's a user in tenant B, and what it does is the user credentials are acquired and verified. That tenant obviously verifies it. It says, yeah, that's fine. User B, it gives a consent to that application to have access to the data in tenant B. And that's when a service principal is created from application in that tenant B for user B to be able to access that application. So obviously it receives the requested token and it accesses the app. So that's a quick way to show how, one way to show how it can be created. The other ways is obviously you can programmatically create the service principal in other tenants as well. Quickly, the types of service principals: you've got application service principals that inherit everything from the that we just spoken about now. So it inherits its things from the application object and it creates it. You've got managed identity, which obviously eliminates the need for developers to manage credentials. So it's a managed identity. You don't have to remember credentials. Actually, no one can know the credentials. It manages credentials itself, and you can enable your application to use the managed identity. You've got a legacy service principal. So there, before the app registrations, if you created an application, that will only have an enterprise app registry in there. So you in Azure AD. So what that means is you will only have a service principal. You won't have app registration for it. So these are three quick types of service principals that we have. Now, a quick relationship, there's too much on it. The main thing, obviously, it's a global representation, and service principal is a local representation for each application. So main thing to remember is your application object or app registration is a one-to-one relationship with the software app, and a one-to-many relationship with its corresponding service principals in different tenants. One last thing is to remember about this is that if you delete an application object, it will also delete the home tenant service principal object. However, if you restore that application object in that tenant, it wouldn't restore the service principal back again. You will have to define one or create one afterwards. That's the main thing to remember. And for the multi-tenant applications, changes to the application objects, they are not reflected in any consumer tenants. So if service principals. So if you make a change to an application object, any other tenants rather than the home tenant for the application, all service principal will need to be updated manually. So that's just a quick example. I think I'm going to skip that. We went through it. It just shows, you've got a tenant. It's got HR app registered in it. It's got service principal in it. But when people from Contoso or Fabricam try to access, the HR app service principal gets created for each Contoso and Fabricam tenants. Now, permissions and scopes and roles quickly. The two types that we can predominantly talk about when we talk about permissions. So we're saying application permissions, they are called roles, and we're saying delegated permissions, they are called scopes. So the application permissions are the permissions that application uses, that are assigned to application that it can use to access on a resource. So it can present those permissions and say, I've got these permissions, give me access to this resource. And application, authenticates itself. So it will be for an API that works without a user context, or application that works without a user context, and it has to authenticate. So the main or important one to remember is the delegated permissions. This is actually amalgamation of the application permissions and the user permissions that is actually trying to sign into the application. So I'm going to talk about effective permissions that will clarify things for it. So for example, application permissions, you've got effective permissions. So you've got, for example, a user can read, write everything. That's the application permissions that have been provided to the application. So what that can do is that can update the profile of every user in the organization. So if we used application just in an application context, and then we try to access the resource, so it will be able to update the profile of every user in the organization. However, when we talk about the delegated permissions, it's the same thing. You've got an application with the permissions with where you can read every user profile within an organization, but this permission, so it depends on what user is trying to access that application. So if a user that's logged into that application is a global admin, they too will overlap, and user will be able to access, and the application will be able to access every user's profile in the organization. However, if a signed in user is not an administrator at all, it's just a normal user, when you logs into application, the application won't be able to read everyone's profile. It will only be able to read the user's profile. So it gives you the least privilege based on what a user has and what an application has. So it's an overlap of those two. So that's a very important thing. And sometimes which is why we say when you define application permissions or roles, try to give only what is required, and not to give, just God permissions, say have everything to it. Because if a user, an admin ends up logging into the application, it will end up having access to all the application will end up having access to all the resources within the organization. So that's one key thing to remember from security perspective. And we'll talk about it here, actually. I jumped the gun over there. So, but yeah, so we mentioned don't enable support for Auth 2 implicit grant flow. We mentioned OAuth, implicit is not secure. So we should use authorization code if we could in its place. We should move beyond username and password. So that's another flow that we spoke about. So that's those two flows are kind of we encourage not to use. So protecting, so that's protecting. So what we'd usually do is providing the secret. So we end up providing this the normal alphanumeric password and saving it in an app registration to access if an application need to authenticate to use the client client credential flow. So we say we should use the certificates instead of the secrets. So, and on top of it, even go a step further and make use of Azure Key Vault. Use a manager identity to keep the certificate that you use, or even the secrets in the Azure Key Vault, and use manager identity for application to go and connect to Azure Key Vault to get those credentials instead of defining them directly in the app registrations. So,
how are you doing for time, Bal?
Yeah, that's just the last slide. I was going to say one last thing is quickly, we're going to go through it, is, ask for permissions and applications absolutely needed, that we've just gone over it. So application permissions, if necessary, use the delegate permissions where possible. That's the best practice to use. And something about the redirect URIs, make sure DNS records are updated, don't use the wildcards, and try and make it HTTPS secure, and try and make sure that they're all up to date all the time and check them on a regular basis. So yeah, so on that, I'm going to stop there. So obviously that's touch up on what was what's under the hood, I guess, as Mark put it to me, really, to whatever, how authorization and authentication works within. Obviously, it's a vast topic. There's a lot, and every time I present this with Mark, I end up going over time. So my apologies for that, Mark. And on that point, I'm gonna stop there. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Back to the slides very briefly, and then we'll open up the mics. So there's a link to get more. I've talked about learning paths numerous times, so I won't go later on that, but there's a link, acroms.identity platform, gives you the links to all the documentation on this stuff. Save the date. So we've got 2 more AppDev Tech Talks on the horizon on 21st of July, DevSecOps, and 6th of August, Green Software Engineering. I've sent out invites to the first one, not the second one yet. So save the dates, and please send feedback on this, whether it's useful. It helps me to get people like Bal and on these events. So any feedback is really useful. Any ideas for content? Slides will be made available, recordings available, and let's open up the mics. And so mics are enabled. You can unmute yourself. So if anybody wants to ask a question, Pete, do you want to go first?
It's really, when we first looked at identity, we started with Azure Active Directory because we thought most of our customers are going to have corporate accounts, and that seemed the easy way. But ultimately, corporate requirements led us down the route of using Azure B2C because we wanted to support things like Google accounts as well as AAD and the like. One of the key things we know, well, there are 2 key things, but the one I asked the question about, really, the differences between doing applications and the MSAL library to sort of do your auth and auth Z, between that and B2C, seem to be around consents, in that we can specify when we do an application that this has access to these permissions we've exposed in an API. In AAD, you can pre-consent to that as an admin to give it to everybody in the org to say they can do that, but you can also leave that to be user consented, so that if someone logs in, they get prompted and they can ask for something and go, please let me do this. That doesn't, last time I looked at least, appear to be present in B2C. The only way to give a login in B2C user access to the permissions is to have an admin consent on behalf of all users rather than do it. And that's a feature we would dearly quite like to make, because we've effectively had to add our own custom app to pass through the things we think a user should be able to do with B2C and JOT tokens in order to do user level control at the APIs, because we can't use scopes, because scopes are effectively what the app was granted by an admin, not what the user accessing the app on behalf is. So kind of like, I'd like to know, is that coming, and do we have any idea of when?
Yeah, that is brilliant, and that's not the first time I've heard this, to be honest, Pete. So it's a common ask. Unfortunately, I cannot give you the timescales on it right now as we stand. But Mark, I think this is something we can check with the PMs for it's a roadmap question, really. So at the moment, you can only admins can grant consent for the B2C app.
And it's a pain compared to the other one. The other one, given that the answer is obviously you guys are going to ask, and hopefully I'll get some feedback, which would be lovely, is again with an AAD app, there is a concept of roles and users being members of roles. So you could check for, Bob is in the role of, I don't know, a local admin. Again, that seems to be missing from B2C. So I guess it's the same question again. That would be really handy, because at the minute we're doing that ourselves again in our app, and again that's a pain when it looks like we could have just used what's in the system had we not been kind of eked down to B2C, because we're looking after data and we're allowing non-Microsoft accounts.
So it's the auditing bit, isn't it?
Well, I was thinking more for the users. You can grant users access to. Sorry, you can grant per group users. Sorry, I said roles, didn't I? That's my brain going a bit melty. What I really meant was groups there, as in AD groups. That seems to be a concept that's not in B2C, which would be really handy.
Yeah. So yeah, they're valid questions, and unfortunately they're roadmap questions, and it's one of those things. B2C is something that but one thing I can say right now at the moment is people or people within Microsoft, they spending their time heavily on this product, and this sort of feedback, to be fair, it helps. What I can obviously do is take it back. As I said, I think it's going to be really hard for me to provide you the timescales, but potentially what we can probably try and have a look at, Mark, is in terms of if they're under consideration, if it is actually work in progress at the moment or not, or are we looking for some more feedback from around the world or whatever, really to get that.
I guess it was Mark's statement that B2C is a superset of AAD, and we've had a couple of things where it appears to be a subset, and those are our two immediate pain points we've had to implement ourselves. So I mean, in terms of software we're currently developing, we have our solution. It's annoying that we've had to write the solution, and I'd rather not do. So if we know it's coming, that would be great news to know, so we can control how much effort we put into doing our own thing.
Now that makes sense. Obviously, it can kind of define your roadmap sort of thing as well, isn't it? What you can do going forward, how much effort you need to put in, and everything. So, I mean, on that point, obviously, we're gonna have to take it away for you.
Peter, could you email that through to me? Then we've got a complete audit trail of you raising it. My email's on the screen.
You're at mark.harrison@microsoft.com, aren't you?
If you could email that over.
I'll try and put that together in a cogent email for you folks.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Someone else can talk now.
That's great.
Yeah. Hello, hi Mark and Baljinder. Thank you so much for this superb presentation, which has cleared lots of our doubts regarding B2C, because we have been working in B2C heavily. And one question for Mark. Mark, okay, when you created that app and it got registered into the app registrations of B2C, my question is, how come it got authenticated into? Because I know you did through the command prompt. You wrote some command, and your application got registered in AD B2C, like app registrations. So in that case, because you were on the same machine, because I just missed that part, how it got created, like it got authenticated in the B2C part. So then I could see your app was there.
So you're talking about that command there. So it had my username there, and I would have, if I hadn't already authenticated, it would have prompted me to. But because I've already logged on the command line with that user ID, it's got the I think it uses like that device ID, like authentication that Bell mentioned. So that's why. If I hadn't put that name on there, it would have prompted me.
Oh, okay. I think now it's more clear.
And that's like a .NET utility that will just go in and edit the code with the client IDs and also do the registration. So saves you having to go into the blades and the UI. It's just a quicker way.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, and also thanks Baljinder for those identification entry. I think that's because for a very long time I have been looking for a similar presentation, but what you just told us, and I think it's brilliant. So thanks a lot, Baljinder, for that.
Great, glad it helps. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's it from my side.
Thanks, Anne. Anyone else got anything else? I know we're over time. I expect most people have dropped off now, but.
No, that was good, thank you. One other thing I wouldn't mind seeing, and it might be a bit specialist, is some kind of like helpful guide on how the hell to use the experience the experience framework part of B2C to build your own flows, because we've stumbled through it based on some examples we found in Gitflow in order to do the theming and some integration. But it strikes me that as exposed by the portal, that's quite hard and complicated. We've managed to scrape together some PowerShell scripts to help do as much infrastructure as code as we can manage in order to deploy a custom B2C with our branding and so forth. But it's been quite complicated, and I don't think anyone in our team is completely convinced we've done it right. It looks like we've done it right, but you know, the experience framework in B2C would be good to see a talk on, but it may just be a bit too specialist for this group.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, have you? So this is all the advanced kind of policies.
It's largely stemmed from us wanting to start with branding and make it very, because we had quite a strong corporate branding through NEC, and sort of that led us down some roads, and then and we were trying to script these things, and it's like this is getting very manual with big instruction documents, and we discovered.
Have you seen all the plugins for Visual Studio Code that helps you with the IntelliSense of those?
I think we have, but I mean, it's still.
Without doubt, it's hard.
Yeah,
it is hard. But the IntelliSense will help, and you can also enable some debugging with the application insight. So I'm not going to say it's easy.
It's kind of goes. We kind of go from "Hello World" with click here to add one of the standard flows to sort of like here's your proper sort of like PhD level complicated with not enough instructions and help. There seems to be no middle ground, so it's quite confusing. But we have got to a point where we can script a deployment of a B2C, put some user accounts in to get us bootstrapped for end-to-end testing in our pipeline, and sort of do the customization of the UI. And so it appears to be working. It's just we've kind of had to guess a bit, and it would be quite nice to have an expert to kind of show you how it should be done.
So I think a couple of things I want to probably won't answer the question, but something I wanted to mention on that topic is the two things. One thing, the two ways of looking at it. One thing is we wanted to make it, so accessible to be able to use with everything else, and it's really hard to kind of put a standard to it if we want to achieve that. We'll be limiting ourselves. Yeah. However, on the flip side, saying that, our long-term goal is, this is what I've been hearing internally, long-term goal is the custom policies are there, yes, but we are working very hard to try and, like your feedback, we hear the feedback and we keep on adding the custom policies into the standard policies under the user policies. So we will work on them. So going forward in future, based on what sort of feedback we receive, the custom policies will be, our goal is to get you to just use the user policies. So you will have a defined policy. You go pick it. You don't have to go through anything. It's all defined for you. You go, it's all done. So that's the goal. It's very, very ambitious, I would say. But there are two sides to it, both sides. I think we're trying to keep the balance.
Yeah. I mean, being able to script what you've done manually in the portal so that we can do it in a pipeline to set up our infrastructure is a great goal for us, because we're trying to do everything else with ARM templates and the odd PowerShell script and things so that we can basically just go click, have a new one. That was quite hard, but I think we've got around that with the custom ones. We might have avoided it, to be honest, if we could have done things like have the call a REST API on sign in, because there seems a weird restriction for the custom web API stuff in the standard flows. Is you can call one when you sign up, but not when you sign in.
I've raised it. Raised it. It's an
oddity, that one.
No, it's a shame, because that would address many scenarios.
Yes, I think it might have avoided us going down the path of the customer experience. Although having done it, I think we've sort of almost got everything as source code now that we need. So it was probably a worthwhile journey, but it was a scary one, and some more guidance around that in the platform would be a great thing. But otherwise,
can you add that to the list of your email?
yeah, I'll try and collect all my thoughts. There's probably
Yeah.
quite a few things we've discovered going down this route.
It adds weight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, lovely. Thank you, folks.
Okay, I think we're well over time now. Is anybody, last chance for any questions? Anybody want to come off mute and ask anything?
Yeah. Hi, Mark and Bell. First of all, thanks for the brilliant session. Really, really useful. A couple of questions might be some really basic from your point of view. One is within our production tenant, if we, for example, register an application to authenticate to, let's say, a SaaS application, Dynamics 365, and we need, obviously, the application needs to access the API. And the always bone of contention between us and admins is that why this application, why do we need to have this grant admin consent? Otherwise, authentication fails. This is always, a touchy question for the admins. How can we come across this discussion with them that in a fashion where they allow this admin consent for the application to authenticate to, for example, Dynamics 365? Because what I've seen is if we don't enable grant admin consent, the authentication fails. If I'm using client ID, let's say client ID and secret-based authentication, or even just app with implicit grant flow. But obviously, Bal, you mentioned implicit grant flow is not something recommended. That's one. Secondly, with the enterprise app, let's say we want to use customer voice, which was previously called Forms Pro. Again, this enterprise using this for the first time with a service account. It requires you a lot of admin consent onto this application, which is again an issue for the global admins. That why do we need to allow this on behalf of XYZ users? How can just we restrict this to particular user, this enterprise app, which is a service account? So if you could just shed some light on this, that would be great on these 2 points.
So what we're saying, so are these applications that you're not able to? So you're saying you are having to provide the admin consent and you can't provide the user consent. You can't.
Yeah, the first one, for example, we've registered an app in Azure AD, which
will provide the, yeah, you can't. So it's application flow, so it doesn't have a user context to it. Correct. So yeah, I mean, the simple way, the only thing that comes to my mind right now, top of my mind, I'm thinking is literally one word keeps coming to me is what I do is security. So it's an application. It's going to try and access the data. So an identity platform, it's part of creating that trust, as Mark mentioned. So it's, yeah, you've registered the application, but now identity platform is going to provide an access to a resource, but it's got to know, it's got to know that admins are aware. So it's not an admin by itself, is it? So it's protecting it. It's going to need someone to tell you, that it's fine for this application to have that access, and that someone will be the administrator. So otherwise, anyone can register any application and have access to your data. So there will be no kind of control over it. It's just putting a control over it.
Right. Okay. And for the second one, let's say if I understand correctly, the enterprise app is not created every time, is it? It
depends how you registered the app. Yes.
Yeah, so let's say I'm going to access customer voice, which was previously called Forms Pro. For the first time, if we try and access that through a service account, it requires permissions on behalf of. Again, this is where the admins have got concerned that okay, we are giving permission in our production tenant to a third party app, which is essentially we try and convince them this is Microsoft first party app, not a third party app. This is always again a tricky discussion with them. How again we have resolved this with the admin.
I think your question is my answer really. It's in place. It's in there to trigger exactly that debate that you mentioned. And well, that's exactly what it's there for. So that I'm going to go back to the same thing. I'm going to say it's just because so that no one can just do anything. So it's there. Look, you've registered the application. It's going to do something. There's going to be that discussion with the admins and the developers to say, okay, this app's going to do this. Admin's going to know what exactly it's going to do and why it's going to do it. So that's why it's there for. So they got to understand if they're getting edited, it's for their own good. Really, they're going to know what's accessing their infrastructure and why it's accessing it. And developers got to define that or explain that to them. So it's there just to trigger that debate that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any more? So let's call it a day. Thanks for your time, and thanks, Bal. See you all next time.
No worries. Thank you all. Really appreciate your time.
Bye.